I'm Professor Mina Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs and Director of our Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency. And I'm in the Department of Political Science. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here today for our final Public Policy and Public Service and Poli-Sci event of the semester. This lecture is part of the Political Science Talks Politics lecture series, which the Political Science Department started in the fall of 2019, fall of 2019, to discuss key issues in the presidential race. We decided to continue the series into the spring of 2021 and fall of 21 to look at issues of policy making and governance. And it's just wonderful to see so many of you in person. I'm recognizing some of my students, even, hi Nika, but even behind the mask. Let me just before I introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Schaefer from Political Science, who will be speaking to us about the crisis of police-minority relations, a few rotten apples or a rotting barrel. Very timely and important subject. I don't want to take much of Professor Schaefer's time, but I would be remiss if I didn't share with you snippets from his wonderful bio, and also just thank all of you and your professors for taking the time to join us. We're especially glad to have Professor Feldman's American Politics class with us, Professor Fritz's, I think it's the nuclear weapons class, Professor Abrams's political sociology class, Professor Schaefer's own class, and numerous other colleagues. Dr. Parati's with us today, numerous other faculty, students, and community members. It's wonderful to have you here to participate in this timely and important discussion. We are very fortunate to have Professor Schaefer share his time and expertise with us today. Professor Schaefer earned his undergraduate degree from George Washington University and a master's degree from Rutgers. He also earned a JD at American University's Washington College of Law. Over the course of his distinguished career, Mr. Schaefer has clerked for a federal judge, worked as an assistant district attorney in Suffolk County, and prosecuted criminal cases as a trial attorney in the organized crime and racketeering section of the U.S. Justice Department. For more than a decade, Mr. Schaefer served as an assistant U.S. attorney with the Organized Crime Strike Force in Northern California. In addition to teaching numerous courses in the Political Science Department, from civil liberties to judicial process to constitutional law, Professor Schaefer has a strong interest in all areas of American politics, particularly the politics and history of American criminal justice. Please join me in welcoming Professor Schaefer. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming out. I don't know if I should thank my own classes, since I kind of forced them to come, but I'm glad you're here. I hope it'll be a useful and productive discussion. I should mention this is my 20th year here at Hofstra, and what I have seen over the last 20 years is a remarkable improvement in quality and involvement in the conscientiousness of our undergraduate student body, and I think this is a good testimony to the fact that you're all very interested in and wanting to stay involved in current events. You know, I'm going to give you maybe a little bit of a warning. I think you're going to be surprised by the position I take on a lot of these issues, because I've spent almost 40 years in the criminal justice system as a prosecutor in various ways. And one would assume, therefore, I come to any of these issues with a pro-government, pro-prosecution bent. You're going to see that that is not the case. I try to be far more balanced and, in many ways, somewhat more critical of the justice system in the United States today and the law enforcement system. And hopefully, by the end of my presentation, which will only take up part of the time, you will have lots and lots of questions to ask and challenges to make. You can challenge me in any way, try to keep the language clean, but anything you want by way of challenge is welcome. I don't know how many of you remember personally, but you certainly remember from the news that in 2014 in Ferguson, we had one of the first well-publicized killings of an unarmed black man, Michael Brown, take place. And while that rocked the conscience of the nation, it did something probably in some ways even more, I'm sorry. Is this better? Sorry about that. Nobody has ever accused me in my entire life of not speaking loud enough, but not only did that wake up the conscience of the nation, but it unveiled a really serious problem. We found that for 50 years, 60 years, we had been fed inaccurate, incorrect information about the rate and number of killings of unarmed and armed civilians by police. The FBI acknowledged that they were undercounting the incidence of racial killings in the United States and killings by police by 50%. And literally overnight, the nation had to come to the realization that we had every year, on average, 1,300 men and women killed by police in our society, in our country. The total number, and I'm not going to give you a lot of numbers today, is that in the 10-year period, we have had about 12,000 such killings. That means 3 Americans each day are killed by the police on the streets of our cities and villages and towns. Now, let me make it very clear. I have used the word killing. I have not used the word murder. I have not used the word unjustified. No one is suggesting, and it would be absolutely irresponsible to think that all of these killings were in any way inappropriate. Many of them were totally justifiable. But the stark reality is that the United States has the unfortunate distinction of being the country of the world that has the highest rate of police killings of civilians in the world. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. The next highest country in terms of the rate of killings by police of civilians is Canada. We are 400% higher than our Canadian neighbors. And if you take all of the highly industrialized, wealthy nations of the world, our rate of killing of civilians by police is 2,000% higher. Now, I know you're used to having justifiable pride in the United States being first in so many areas. This is not an area we want to be first in, because this is a very, very significant impact on not only what our judicial and law enforcement system is, but goes to the very heart of the American experience. Now, far more disturbing than the number of killings is who is being killed. Because the fact is, we can't hide from it, that the vastly disproportionate number of individuals who are shot and killed by the police are Black and Hispanic. The numbers speak for themselves, and while I promised you I was not going to give you a lot of numbers, I'm going to give you these, because these are things that I like to think you may want to think about after this presentation is over. The total population of the United States, 13% of all individuals in America are black. And yet, 27% of police killings are of blacks, and 35% of unarmed police killings are of blacks. So get your head around those numbers. Blacks are 3 times more likely to be shot and killed, even though unarmed, by police than are white Americans. This is some to make the argument that the police have 2 gun triggers, 2 triggers on the gun. One when dealing with white America, one when dealing with black America. Now, I know, before I go any further, there are people now in the audience who are saying, oh my God, Schaefer's going to tell us that every cop in America is a racist who's out to kill black people. And that's absurd. If this discussion is going to lead anywhere, we're going to have to be far more sophisticated about why this is happening. I don't want any of you to think that this is either a condemnation of or an exoneration of our law enforcement officers. I work with them all the time. What it is a recognition that they are both an offender and a victim of a system that leads to this phenomenon that we're going to be talking about today. I don't think I need to dwell on the severe psychological and economic impact that such killings have on families and immediate friends of the victim. I've met with some of those people, and I can tell you that it is a gut-wrenching, horrible position. However, a recent study was published by Harvard University, the public health department at Harvard, a professor by the name of David Williams. And he said, I'm not interested in only talking about what happens to the wife or the son or the daughter or close friends of individuals who are shot, but I want to know what happens to the greater community. And so he did a study which indicated, and I'll say this slowly because it's kind of important that we understand it, that every time the police shoot and kill an unarmed black person, the mental and psychological health of the entire black population of the state in which the shooting occurred was negatively impacted. So when we think about shootings, when we think about killings, it's very much like taking a rock and throwing it into a pond. We always focus on the initial splash, the actual killing of that one person, the family of that one person, the close neighbors of that one person. But if you continue to look at the pond, you begin to see the ripples floating outward from the initial dropping of the stone. Those ripples are the effect that these shootings have on the entire population of a state. By the way, just as an interesting question to keep in the back of your mind, the study revealed that there was no impact on white populations when white unarmed civilians were killed. So that suggests to you that there's something more going on than the simple individual killing of one person. White America responds to shootings, even of white civilians, far differently than Black Americans, Hispanic Americans react to Black and Hispanic shootings. We have to try to figure that out. Today, I would like to suggest to you first, just to make it clear, so there's no misunderstanding, police are permitted to use force, including lethal force, in a completely legal manner. If you're interested, the Supreme Court case that you might want to one day look at is a case called Tennessee versus Garner. And in that case, the Supreme Court held that an officer who reasonably believes that a suspect poses a threat of serious harm to the officer or to others may use force up to and including lethal force. Now that sounds great. Sounds like a wonderful standard, except it creates a hole that you could drive a truck through. Because every time there is a shooting, every time there is a possible case being brought against the officer, the question is, how much do we defer to that officer's reasonableness in making the decision? The fact is, unfortunately, and I hope I haven't been guilty of this, but I don't know, police, prosecutors, and juries appear to give police enormous deference in accepting their view of the justifiableness of their action. Let's go back. Of those 12,000 plus killings that I talked to you about earlier, of those 12,000, 153 police officers were charged with a crime. 153 out of 12,000. Of those 153, only 38 were convicted. Of those 38 who were convicted, only 7 were convicted of homicide, of murder. So, just looking at the numbers, one would have to think that the deference paid to law enforcement is so great that it becomes almost impossible to secure charges, let alone a conviction, against officers who have been involved in such shootings. In my career, I've prosecuted 3 officers for engagement in such behavior. And I always like to brag to my classes that I had a pretty good conviction rate, about 98%. I don't normally talk about those 3 cases, however. I lost every one of them. Each of those 3 cases, the jury came back and found in favor of the police officer. And while I never, ever second-guess juries, one has to wonder what it would take to get enough evidence to secure such a conviction. Today, however, what I want to do is talk about why. Why do we have this problem? And here is where I suggest to all of us that we are debating a false dichotomy. How many of you, I'm sure, have heard that the debate is, oh, is this problem caused by a racist police department or a racist society? Is it caused by individual officers, or you've all heard the term systemic racism? And I would suggest to you that's a false choice. I would suggest to you that both explanations build upon one another, that there's enough blame to go around, that yes, there are things about individual officers that we need to confront, there are things about police departments that we need to confront, and there are things about society that we need to confront. But if we confront only one or two of them, it's like trying to sit on a stool with only two legs. It's not going to work. So let's see if we can deconstruct the argument. So I want to take you to the year 2017. Another killing. This was by a Milwaukee police officer, Dominique Hagen Brown. And Brown was found to have shot and killed an unarmed 23-year-old black man by the name of Sylville Smith. Now, the very day of the shooting, the Milwaukee Police Department issued a public press release saying this clearly could not have been an act of racism by the Milwaukee police. And can any of you think of the reason why the Milwaukee police could issue or issued that statement? I'm sorry? The officer was black. And the Milwaukee police said, give us a break. How could you possibly accuse a black police officer of racism in shooting a black unarmed man? In doing so, in making that statement, I would suggest to you that the authorities displayed a lack of understanding of how institutional racism occurs. Racial bias is not necessarily how a person views himself, but rather it's how he views others in terms of race. And that systemic racism, which I suggest has been around since our history began, corrupts our view of minorities in America. And it corrupts the view of minorities, of both minorities and non-minorities. That is, the police themselves, like all of us, have come to think of minorities as different and distinct from us. Individual officers, whether black or white, are viewing black and Hispanic young men through a prism that society has created. And you know, there was a famous quote by the Reverend Jesse Jackson many years ago. And he took enormous grief for saying it. But he was asked about racism and about racial prejudice. And this leading black civil rights advocate said, look it, I'm going to be really honest with you. When I'm walking down the street late at night and I hear footsteps behind me and I turn, despite knowing that I should not feel this way, I am grateful if the people behind me are white because I think I'm safer. Now, I don't think anybody's going to accuse Jesse Jackson of being a racist, but he has had, like all of us, that sense of how we perceive others to generate how we behave. When it comes to police, it's more important, of course. How I feel or how you feel about others is important. How police feel about others and perceive others is a life and death decision. All of what I've said so far can be summarized, I think, by a quote from a professor from the University of California, Irvine. And what he said was, police are cops first, and they are their race second. Think about those words. Police are cops first, and they are their race second. So when an officer, white or black, is on the street responding to an escalating situation, that quote suggests the police mind is the thing that determines what occurs, not the individual and his own individual perceptions. I hope that kind of makes sense to you to suggest why we need to look at both the individual officer and the greater system. And what I'd like to do in the last about 15 minutes before we turn it over to questions is talk about first individual police officers. How many of you, just by a show of hands, have heard somebody say, oh, the only problem are a few bad apples in the police department? We hear it all the time. We hear it all the time that it's only a small number of reprehensible officers who are causing all of these killings. That there are a few bad apples in every police force, authoritarian, racist, who take great pleasure in pummeling and doing worse to minorities. Like all theories, there's a grain of truth in this. The fact is that if you look at criminal reports dealing with these killings, a relatively small percentage of police officers account for a large percentage of the killings or the cases of police brutality. There are bad police, and to get rid of them would solve some of the problem. However, this explanation has lost a lot of viability in the last number of years. Because if any of you have ever studied the law enforcement system, you know that historically we recruited into our police departments the very type of officers we don't want. Under the patronage system that we used to have in this country, we would hire police officers who had little skill, high levels of authoritarianism, a propensity for brutality, but we hired them because they had the vote. And when we hire people under patronage, It's give them a job in exchange for a vote. So we get today, then rather, the worst of the worst. And if I were giving this lecture 100 years ago, I would probably say we have a lot of bad apples and leave it at that. That's the problem. But the good news, and there's a little bit of good news in this lecture, the good news is we are doing a far better job recruiting and screening. Do any of you in this audience have any expectations of perhaps one day going into law enforcement? Okay, a few. If you do, you will be going through a screening process the likes of which you have rarely seen. We are going to screen out the bullies, the authoritarian types. We do a better job of, in fact, handling who we get into our police departments. But the problem is what happens next. Because criminologists have come up with a theory called the working personality of the police officer. The working personality of the police officer. And what that theory argues is that from the day the officer is accepted into the police department, a socialization process begins that turns what was a fair-minded, equal, non-aggressive, non-racist individual into something quite different on the street. Each of us, every one of us in this room knows that we are a product of who we interact with. We are a product of who teaches us. We are a product of who and what we experience and see in the world. Now I want you to take a journey with me through what police officers see. First is their training and their being tutored by a senior police officer. Every police officer, when they are accepted into an office, go to an academy to learn the lessons to be a police officer, and are then assigned what is called a field training officer. Field training officers are the senior officers in the department who have been there for many, many years. And what the training and what the tutorage of the field officer tell the young new policeman is that you will be in constant danger on the street, that you will be experiencing terrible situations that will threaten your safety and your very survival. You will hear the war stories. You will hear all of the informal suggestions to the young officer. Don't under-respond, over-respond. The best defense is a strong offense. That aggressiveness is in fact what we would expect to be our adapting behavior to survive. So the officer goes out into the street to do his job, and he escalates the interaction. Not because he wants to be a racist, not because he wants to be a bully, but because to him, the lesson he has learned is if you don't take the initiative, if you don't show who's boss, if you don't assert yourself, the individual who you are dealing with will gain the upper hand. Now, it's important to understand that not only are the officers told you have to be fearful of anyone you find on the street, but the officers learn from their superiors and their colleagues, you really have to be careful about young Black and Hispanic men. They're the ones that are going to cause the most trouble. Now, here is where maybe the most difficult concept today has to be understood. Let's think about that officer who has just said to a rookie, be careful of the young Blacks, be careful of the young Hispanics. Now, you could justifiably say that senior officer must be a bigot. How dare he come up with these generalized conclusions? But I want you to understand, and we're going to talk about it in about 2 minutes, that those senior officers have spent 20 years on the street where, because of things like profiling and Terry stops that we're going to talk about, those officers' experience has been that a disproportionate number of the men that they have had to arrest, who have attacked them, who they have had to subdue, are Black and Hispanic. So what those officers are relating is their own experience. But their own experience is not based on reality systemically, system-wide, but on what they have been placed into by the police department. Let's cut to the quick for 1 moment to make sure we all understand this. If I send one of you as a young police officer out into an all-Black community for your entire career, the only people you are going to have problems with during your career are Blacks. If I send you into an all-Asian neighborhood, the experiences that you're going to have which are negative are going to be based on encounters with Asian Americans. Well, if you have had a history of only dealing with one segment of society and they have had some individuals who have challenged you, your mind is saying to yourself, I'm not racist. I'm not trying to cast aspersions. I am simply responding to the facts as I have experienced them. That's why I say I don't want to blame the cop for being a racist, for being biased. He or she has responded based upon what has been put upon them. Now, there's another problem. And all of you have probably heard this. It's called the Code of Silence. You know that the traditional view is that when a police officer engages in some bad behavior, those other officers who have seen or experienced that bad behavior are going to ignore it. Look into the case of Rodney King, or a young Black man named Abner Louima in Brooklyn in 1999, when there were dozens of police officers witnessing horrendous brutality, and they came up with what we call blue amnesia. That is, I didn't see a thing. The problem that we have, one of the problems that we have, is being able to get tangible evidence when such behavior between police and civilians take place. Now, I will tell you, again, remember I said there's always a little bit of good news? Well, we do have some improvements. You've all heard about the use of body cams and dashboard cams as one way of trying to record bad behavior, because even if the police develop amnesia, they are still going to have to confront the video. But unfortunately, body cams have great deficiencies, because in almost every police department in the country, police officers have the authority to do that and turn off the body cam, therefore hiding what is possibly a much more serious incident. But the really good news comes from the fact of every one of you possessing, you got it, one of these. Because if you look in the last 6 or 7 years, the few successful prosecutions that we have had of police misconduct has been based upon evidence provided by civilians. The George Floyd case is by far the best example. You know, everybody said, oh, the great news from George Floyd's case is we finally broke the code of silence. We didn't. We put a little pinprick in it. 2 officers were willing to testify against the 4 defendants who were convicted. 13 officers were not willing to testify. But there was a civilian, one of you, who took a cell phone and had the courage to view that incident for 9 minutes and 30 seconds. And that piece of evidence, more than anything else, is what, in fact, led to the conviction that we saw in Minneapolis. Last 2 points. My students are always worried when I say that, because it means there are about 9 points to come, but I will promise you it'll only be 2 points. The other huge problem, and now we're moving away from individual officers, is the use of the Terry stop and the use of profiling. Now again, I don't want to insult this audience, because I'm sure most of you are aware, but in 1968, the Supreme Court issued one of probably the most significant criminal justice cases, opinions, in the case of Terry versus Ohio. And without getting into too much detail, Terry versus Ohio said that police may, based only upon reasonable suspicion, stop, question without providing Miranda warnings, and frisk an individual. So you can be walking down the street, and if an officer has what he views as reasonable suspicion, he can stop and frisk you. Now, all of you, I know, have heard the criticisms of stop and frisk. First, that they were disproportionately used against young Black and Hispanic men. In the 10 years of the Bloomberg administration in New York City, the New York City Police Department engineered 4 million stop and frisks. 4 million. Of those 4 million, I need you now, a few more statistics. Black and Hispanic males between the ages of 14 and 24. Black Hispanic males between the ages of 14 and 24 account for just under 5% of New York City's population. 5%. of the 4 million stops conducted by the police, 4 million Terry stops, 42% were of Black and Hispanic males between the ages of 14 and 24. 44% roughly, compared to a population of 4.7%. Sometimes a human story says it best. I met a student, a very, very good student, who was going to LaGuardia Community College in New York, in Brooklyn. In Queens. That student was going to college, which was about 9 blocks from where he lived with his family. The student was a young Black man. In the space of 1 year, just walking from his home to the college, he was stopped and frisked 9 times. Now, I want you to try, and some of you I'm sure can, but I'd like all of you to try to put yourself in the mind of that student. Because, of course, every single time he was stopped and frisked, nothing was found. He was a law-abiding, hard-working young man going to college. And by the way, that's true of most stop and frisks. You know, of the 4 million stop and frisks I just told you about, 86% found evidence of nothing, were totally and completely useless. Now, I know that most lectures you get, including, I think, if Michelle Alexander's lecture came to you, the focus would be on how unfair that is, how discriminatory that is, how it leads to arrests sometimes. But I want to look at it at a slightly different angle. Because every stop and frisk is an invitation for an escalation of conflict between the officer and the person being stopped that could lead to tragedy. You know, one of the things I would urge all of you to think about is that most of the shootings, most of the incidents that you have read about where an officer has stopped a Black man and it's escalated into a shooting, the Black man at worst was engaged in either no criminal behavior or very minor criminal behavior, and escalating to the point of shooting. And that makes sense if you think about it. From the perspective of the officer, this is one of those people that we have to be careful about. One of those individuals that I have to be aggressive toward. One of those individuals that I have to take the offensive toward. From the Black male perspective, another example of the police invading our community, another example of the police overreacting, another example of the police displaying racism. You know, most arguments I've learned are when the two sides have completely different interpretations of reality. And in every Terry stop, the officer and the person being stopped come from very different mindsets. And then finally, and I'll just mention this, the other thing that has contributed to this phenomenon of shootings is what we call the paramilitarization of our law enforcement. Since, and I want to get the exact date for you, since 2006, the federal government has sent, and listen to this number, $6.2 billion in aid to our law enforcement departments. And this aid consists of half armored trucks, helicopters, drones, assault weapons, grenade launchers. We are equipping our police department as if they were the military. And in the use of these equipment, we re-emphasize what I want to end with today, that we are, in the police and public view, still involved in a war on crime. And if any of you remember your early classical studies, Cicero said it best: in time of war, there is no law. Well, the war we are fighting is a war against, quote, criminals. But unlike traditional wars, where the enemy is well known, he wears a uniform, in our war, our, quote, enemies don't identify themselves. And so we use the racial profiling, the stereotyping, to try to find those individuals. And the last thing about war, and we all know this, is we accept collateral damage. You all know that in a war like in the Middle East, we find a building housing terrorists, and we order a drone strike. Nobody argues against that. But the drone accidentally blows up an orphanage next to the building and kills 50 orphans. And we say, well, what do you have? What can you expect? War is collateral damage. I would suggest to you, really, that those 12,000 killings, a good number of them are the collateral damage of a system fighting a war and displaying this systemic racism that we have talked about throughout the discussion. That's all I have to say. Now I want you to start talking. Questions or comments or anything that any of you feel should be brought up or discussed.
Thank you, Professor Schaefer. If you would please come up here when you ask a question and use the microphone. Thank you.
I just had a comment to make. I was the officer in the Westbury NAACP, and a case was brought before us, Kyle Howell. He had been beaten in Westbury by the police, and his family wanted us to intervene and do something. And I had the sad thing to tell them. I said, this is going nowhere, because the police are going to stand together. They're going to say, your son did something, and nobody is going to hold them accountable for what happened. But they didn't come from America. They came from another country, and they didn't believe me. So they went ahead, and they filed a lawsuit. And the young man was traumatized because he had been using his cell phone when they stopped him. And he was recording them, and they didn't like it. So that's what precipitated his getting beaten. But they forgot, or didn't know, that the stop, there was a camera there. It took the whole scene, what happened. But even with that, it was very difficult to get an indictment. One officer was indicted because the grand jury could see him hitting something in the car. He was indicted. We were so, we couldn't believe this. Somebody got indicted. So we went to court. Police turned out, it must have been 100 officers there. They were upstairs. It was so crowded, and I'm tall. I'm 5 feet 10 inches tall. They were much taller than I am. It was like you almost felt intimidated. Anyway, we get into the courtroom. One side is all officers, then we have a little side for the family. They were making so much noise outside, which I thought was disrespectful. The judge had to send a court officer outside to tell them to quiet down, and they had to move out. Then when we found out it wouldn't be a jury trial, it was going to be trial by a judge, I said, that's it. Fix is in.
Well, I have to tell you, I don't know if any of you have been very appropriate to the comment you were making. In the Rittenhouse case that's being argued right now, the defense attorney 2 days ago made what I consider to be one of the most extraordinarily inappropriate comments to the judge. He said, you know, Judge, there are an awful lot of black pastors in this courtroom watching this trial, and that could influence the jury incorrectly. I'm sorry?
Arbery.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I agree. My mind. But what I found so extraordinary is the fact that that's the exact opposite of what usually happens, because I have seen this myself, that you have a case where an officer is being charged with something and the blue wall comes into the courtroom.
Oh, yes.
Hundreds of police officers sitting there, and you at least have to ask yourself, what is the psychological impact on a jury when hearing these points?
But my point is, it makes you feel that it's almost hopeless to aggrieve anything that's done, because you know it's going nowhere. Even though one was indicted and it was national news because the NAACP and other organizations got involved. But it didn't go anywhere. But I was glad that at least it was heard.
And then there are the occasional victories. The Floyd conviction is
Right.
at least one. But I agree with you. There's a lot of room for improvement that is needed.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was curious about your thoughts about the difference between training and recruitment, because there's a lot of and I guess a third prong to that would be policies within the department. Because I think a lot of the conversation that happens around police brutality and police violence takes place under the idea of, like, potentially this is something that could be fixed through training, like implicit bias training, I think is one of the ones that gets brought up a ton.
Sure. And a lot of police academies are doing just as you suggest, that, you know, I teach occasionally at a couple of the academies, and we talk about some of the things that need to be accomplished. I'm going to give you a very simple answer. Intensive training in an academy can be wiped away in 3 weeks of riding with a partner who is telling you everything they just taught you at the academy is crap. You have to learn the real world from that officer's perspective. Now, I'm not arguing we shouldn't do the training. Of course we should. But I think we have to be careful not to over-hope that that training is going to have any effect in the long term until, and this maybe is, you know, the ranks get cleared out. You know, change takes time. You can recruit new young people that are going to have a great impact, but their impact is going to be greatest in 10 years if they remain consistent when they're sitting in the officer's seat telling the new rookie what the realities are.
So you think it's ultimately like an internal culture issue?
Yeah,
above
it
all
has to be.
else? Yeah.
It has to be. You know, and that's another issue we have seen, I think, a lot. One of the arguments is that police are living in what they call a social curtain or a blue curtain, that they encounter only other police officers. it's not just on the job, but have any of you ever seen the movie Cop Town or looked at the Rodney King case? Police officers tend to congregate and live in clusters. There are villages and towns here on Long Island that have high levels of police, which means that in the off hours, the socializing, the barbecues, the bowling, the movies, the get-togethers are with other police officers. And that begins to create a curtain of seeing the world from the perspective of the officer, not the rest of society.
Hello. I just wrote a little something because earlier, I recall you saying that police officers should be aware, I believe, of young Black and Hispanic communities when they go into them. But I'm just going to be real right now. All right, so policing in the U.S. started in one of two ways. Slave patrols in the South and private agencies to check laborers in the North. Policing has always been about monitoring like Black bodies and the poor rather than addressing crime. So my question is police reform best addressed at the federal level or locally? Cities have started to announce policy changes on, for instance, the use of chokeholds, such as in the case of Eric Garner back in 2014, I believe. Congressional Democrats have introduced legislation aimed at reducing the use of force and increasing accountability. Yeah.
Well, let me first say you articulated, and I am not being gratuitous in this, you articulated very well the extreme view that much of what is happening is not accidental but is designed. The Black Lives Matter movement, the defund the police movement, often include as part of their plank that police were originally organized and intended to control minorities, and that is simply what is continuing to happen. That is a debate that I would love to have at some point again, because it is really a critical debate. As to your specific question, I don't think a national response is possible legally, constitutionally. Unfortunately, because of the power of federalism in the states tend to have too much control over their own police departments, and by definition, local communities are creatures of the state, so they have to respond to what the states do. So you get a progressive proposal in before Congress. First, I don't know it'll pass, but also it will face significant constitutional barriers because of the traditional police power reserved to the states. The other problem is if we leave it to the states, we're going to go back to what we've had for so many years, a divided blue and red country. Cities that are making meaningful reforms tend, and I'm generalizing, and generalizations are always a little bit dangerous, but I am generalizing that most of the progressive reforms have come from our blue states. You're not going to find those same types of reforms in many other states. And so if we leave it to the states, which unfortunately I think we have to do, we're going to have a bifurcated criminal justice system in this country.
Thank you.
How you doing? This young lady from the NAACP stated that a profound flaw in the case serving to their disadvantage was that a bench trial was taking place in regards that there was an absence of a jury. Aren't they at full discretion to waive their right for a jury trial?
In most jurisdictions, you're absolutely right, the defendant has the right to waive the jury and go with a bench trial. In some states, not all, but in some states, that also requires the consent of the prosecution. But the fact is that defendants, and I don't know the exact circumstances of this case, normally choose juries because all you have to do to not be convicted is get one juror to vote in your favor. When you have a bench trial, it's a juror of one, and that judge makes that determination. Now, I think, and I am completely hypothesizing, the choice of choosing a bench trial may well be based on what the defense believes is the judge's predisposition. We all know, I mean, I do it all the time, and defense attorneys do it as well. You go into a court and you can look at a roster of judges and say, he's pro-police, he's pro-defense, he's pro-government, he's pro-whatever. Maybe when you're at that point, because you know ahead of time who your judge will be, you'll make that decision.
So the bench trial should be serving as an advantage for the individual, not a disadvantage, correct?
It should be serving as an advantage to the individual based upon that individual's view of what the jury pool is going to be. Remember, and you know this, I know, it's a very calculated decision because you not only have to look at what's the makeup and nature of the judge, but who are you going to get for those 12 men and women who are going to be serving on the jury? And it's a whole different story, but another part of the problem is our jury selection process is enormously biased in terms of not getting a reasonable cross-section of society, or of the community.
All right, thank you very much.
Professor, hi. I think you were too.
I'm sorry, could you just talk into the microphone so
Yeah.
I can hear you? Thank you.
You were talking about police training. I think I have to say, Professor, that it's not acceptable to give them a free pass with this intergenerational racism. So after the police officer gets out of the academy, if he's well trained, he or she should be a professional. And somehow, then there's a problem. And the last two sentences of your presentation, you said there was structural racism. However, leading to that, I didn't get that feeling. So is it structural racism that when they get out of the police academy, the veteran police officer is going to say racist perspectives? And let me just say one more thing. Seldom, if ever, is a police officer that spends 20 years in a solidly black neighborhood, Latina. It's a mixed bag. So is it intergenerational racism? Is it systemic racism?
Well,
Okay.
the way I would answer the part of that, at least, is if you look at statistics as to what police officers are being charged with police brutality cases. And one would, I think, maybe intuitively assume that the young men and women who are coming out of the academy, the recruits, being unsure of themselves, being afraid, they would be the ones who would have a disproportionately high incidence of brutality claims made against them. But the exact opposite is true. Very significantly, it is senior police officers who are the ones who are being charged with and challenged for their behavior.
They have internalized, they have internalized the negative images that the dominant group.
100% agree with you. And that's why, and now you asked at the beginning, is that structural racism?
Yes.
One of the reasons I didn't spend a lot of time debating that is I don't know myself, and I'm not sure most people know exactly what they mean by structural racism. Maybe it's the young man who spoke, my eyes aren't good enough, who talked about the defund the police. I responded with
It's
the defund
exactly
the police.
the veteran police officers, as you just said, socializing the new recruits.
Right, but veteran police officers engaging with other police officers and, in a sense, socializing young officers. I don't think meets the definition that most people think of when they hear of the term structural racism. I think structural racism is a far more malignant concept where we have the government itself and society deliberately trying to achieve the oppression of one group against
Okay,
another.
fair enough. So what is your definition of what's happening?
We should probably move on. There are a few more.
Pardon me.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
No. We have 3 more questions. We'll try to get them all in if we can.
Yes, kind of connecting to the previous question, I am concerned with how do we go about taking this internal culture of racism out of the police whenever we have considerations of individual racism within and systemism without, and we know that that the far right has a connection with the police force, as well as like the police force already has this basic definitional purpose not to prevent crime, but I mean I can't remember what Supreme Court decision was like they have no real obligation to like protect life. They have the obligation to protect property. And so I don't see.
I don't know the answer, but I will give you one suggestion, and this is one of the areas where I think the defund the police movement is so strong, but is so misunderstood. I am sure when most people hear the term defund the police, they say, oh my God, these are people who want no police officers any longer. They want to do away with departments. Defund the police, at least from my understanding, is we begin to shift the function of the police. That we don't make the police do a lot of things that are a waste of time for the police to be doing. Give them more time to do what they should be doing, but redefine that definition. And I think you said it beautifully, shifting the emphasis from protecting property back to the idea of protecting life. Now, there is an old theory that I have supported in the past, and I know it's old-fashioned, but it's called the broken window theory. I do think that makes some sense, that we engage in trying to solve the police-community relationship with the small things first. You don't try to completely change overnight. So the old broken window theory is that if you start seeing graffiti on the street, you start seeing broken windows, that you take not the police, because they're not capable, but they're not supposed to be wiping graffiti off, but to give that part of the function to another part of the government, and that is a way of beginning to make the community less hostile and therefore more prone to those kinds of encounters.
All right, thank you.
My question is, what is your take on Black Americans who suffer from mental health issues and how they're more likely to be targeted by the police?
Sure.
And
I
how
mean,
like
I'm
they're
sorry, shouldn't have interrupted.
and how like sensory issues by like police sirens and lights and handcuffs and questioning and all of that.
Sure. Go back to the decision in Terry versus Ohio, when the Supreme Court said it's based upon reasonable suspicion. The court added one more sentence, which is really the most dangerous sentence. They say, under the totality of the circumstances, which means the police define the circumstances as they see it. So a person who is disoriented, who is fazed by lights, who doesn't respond quickly to a command, is a totality of the circumstance justifying the officer's escalation of power, but has a perfectly innocent explanation. One of the very first cases I ever prosecuted as the DA, the defendant, I found out, turned out to be epileptic, and she was having an epileptic encounter. When the police ordered her out of the car, she refused. The police dragged her out and charged her with obstruction. I dismissed the case on my own. I'm allowed to do that as a prosecutor. I said, we're not going to do this. That's the kind of thing that we have to become so much more sensitive to. I agree with you completely.
Thank you.
The thing that bothers me the most is that the percentage of black people that are incarcerated far exceeds the amount of white people. And I truly believe that there are many, many black people that are in jail that don't belong there because they didn't do the crime that they were convicted of. What do you,
I would only correct one statement of yours.
go ahead.
There are more white people in jail than black people,
Oh, really?
but proportionately, blacks are incredibly overrepresented. The statistic is really pretty simple. 13 to 14% of America is black. 40 to 44% of our prisons are black. So we have a rate of incarceration 4 times higher. As to your first statement, you are 100% correct about how many people are in prison. Probably one of the most recited statistics. The United States has 5% of the world's population, 23% of the world's prisoners.
That's true.
So we incarcerate at a higher rate than any other nation in the world.
Do you believe that there are more people, there are a lot of people that are in prison that don't belong there?
Oh,
You know, a lot of
absolutely.
innocent people.
And that's not a racial issue.
No?
I mean, for many years, one of the largest percentages of prisoners were there for nonviolent marijuana offenses.
Well,
Well, look, it costs us on average about $70,000 a year to house a prisoner. I would spend 10 times that amount to house a rapist or to house a murderer. To spend $70,000 a year to put somebody behind bars because they smoke pot strikes me as a ludicrous use of our resources. And there we have made progress. At least in the last number of years, we are starting to reduce the number of nonviolent drug offenders going to prison. That indirectly will help in the racial imbalance, because we know that blacks and whites in this country consume drugs at about the same rate. And yet the arrest rate and conviction rate for blacks is astronomically higher than for whites.
And-
So sometimes one reform will lead to
okay.
others.
All right, okay. All right, I'll give.
Hi. So, from all the movements through protests against police brutality, especially against black people, and the understanding of, or not understanding, or like miscommunications of, or black people in jail, or the Blue Lives Matter, from all of this violent, or all these acts and ideals, do you think the amount of black people who are dying by police is just a time bomb of a greater violence that are about to come, such as George Floyd? Do you think there's going to be another instance that there's going to be another George Floyd, and that the amount of protests and violence that are going to occur will be too great for law enforcement to handle?
You know, it's a great question, and given my age, it's not surprising to you. I mean, I lived through the 60s and 70s and the periods of time when we had these massive protests. And I guess one of the great disappointments in my life is the fact that the American people seem to have such a short attention span and such a short commitment to whatever it is they are fighting for. And I think at the height of the protests following George Floyd's murder, we saw this massive outpouring in the streets, these protests, but things have kind of calmed down, haven't they? They've kind of petered off. I mean, there are still very admirable attempts at trying to affect change, but you wonder how long it takes before you hit that point. You know, one of the things you talked about the Blue Lives Matter movement and all of those, and this may be a suggestion, a strategy for all of us. I've listened to those Blue Lives Matters organizations, and they take umbrage most not at allegations of systemic racism. They take umbrage at the idea that they are being called individually racist. So maybe if we tone down the rhetoric and we say, look, we're not suggesting the police officer is evil. We're suggesting that the police officer is a function of an evil system that has created this problem. You may actually reduce the resistance to the reforms that many are talking about.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we're going to take, this is going to be the last question here, so we'll take two more if we can do it.
Okay, so my question was in regards to police socialization. So previously you were talking about how some of the veteran officers and their influence on rookies after their training might affect their overall procedural happenings. So my question to you is, what do you think, or how do you think we can change the police experience? Therefore, they wouldn't feel the need to use these indirectly or maybe purposefully racist procedures for handling minorities.
Well, I think we have to first deal with, and I know this is a topic that you don't hear much about, but there is this unique person called the FSO, who is the person who will be the tutor of that individual for a set number of months after the officer comes out of the academy. We have done studies of these FSOs, and we find that they are among the worst of our problems with police officers. So one suggestion that came out of the John Jay School was the fact that we create a nationwide training academy for field service officers, that in a sense we give them the ability to get training well beyond what the academy provides, to try to socialize them to in turn socialize those that they are training. But you know, if I had the answers, I would probably have written a book and be sitting in Jamaica right now drinking a pina colada. I don't know the answers to these things, but I do know, or at least I think, that if we continue on the path we are on, that bifurcation, that division is going to become ever greater. Because it's a self-fulfilling cycle. Violence begets violence, confrontation begets confrontation, and I hope it doesn't happen, but at some point there may be a conflagration point where everything just begins to spin out of control.
All right, thank you.
Hello, my name is Ariadne. It's a pleasure to meet you. I actually have a friend of mine who's an alumni of Hofstra University, and he just joined the academy. His name is Peter Syme, and he has told me that he feels very conflicted a lot of the times because, as you said, they are taught to be a little aggressive and to approach individuals in a way where they have to be showing who's boss, and that can be very difficult at times. Would you suggest that when police officers meet with these tutors, instead of telling them to have an approach of being so, showing who's boss and being so mean and cruel when dealing with these individuals, do you think that there should be a different approach to that, and do you think that that would resolve a lot of the racism?
Well, it's a great question, and here is where, if I give the answer that I feel in my heart, the response is, oh my God, he is an academic and he has lost sense with reality, because, I have lots of good friends who are FBI agents and police officers, and I have sometimes said, why don't you just go up to people you stop on the street and try to de-escalate the situation? And they look at me and say, are you nuts? Are you crazy? Because from their perspective, that instant 2 or 3, 5 seconds of the initial interaction is where you set the parameters. And it's asking, I admit, it's asking a lot of police officers to take that risk, to reduce that volume. I have to say, there is something to the idea of the violence on the street. Study last month came out of the Los Angeles Police Department. 18% of the officers are now suffering from post-traumatic stress for those encounters they have on the street. So I don't want to leave this discussion saying police officers are a bunch of wusses who need to start acting more responsibly. Their job is horrendously difficult. And so when I come up with these ideas, it is from the relative sanctuary of being in a Hofstra faculty office now as opposed to being on the street with a police officer in that regard.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. If anybody has
Thank you,
questions, I'm
Professor
staying
Schaefer.
around. I'll be happy to answer them, but otherwise, thank you very much for coming.